The morning Anna Winslow walked into the Sweetwater County Land Office with her dead husband's Colt revolver strapped to her hip. The whole territory seemed to hold its breath, and one man made the mistake of smiling. She had ridden 14 miles through the October dust of 1878 Wyoming territory to be here, and the ache in her lower back from the saddle was nothing compared to the ache that had lived behind her sternum for the past 3 months. 3 months since they had buried Thomas Winslow on the eastern edge of their claim, beneath a stand of cottonwood trees that rattled their yellow leaves now in the autumn wind. 3 months since she had stood over that mound of fresh-turned earth and promised herself and him, and whatever God might be listening across those vast open skies, that she would not lose the land too. The gun had been Thomas's, a single-action Colt Army revolver, well-oiled and serious, the grip worn smooth in exactly the shape of her husband's hand. She had taken to wearing it because the nights were long and the ranch sat alone, and because a woman alone in Wyoming territory in 1878 needed something more persuasive than a polite request when strangers came calling. She wore it on her right hip because that was where Thomas had worn it, and she supposed she wore it also because it was the closest thing to him she had left. She pushed open the door of the land office with one hand. The bell above it rang thin and bright in the cool air. There were 3 men inside. A clerk sat behind a wide oak counter, a man of perhaps 50 with ink-stained fingers and the permanently harassed expression of someone who dealt daily in disputed boundaries and unpaid fees. 2 other men stood near the window, ranchers by the look of them, both wearing the dust of the trail and the proprietary ease of men who had never once questioned their right to stand exactly where they were standing. It was one of these men who smiled. He was broad through the shoulders and wore a hat with a crease down the center, and when Anna came through the door, his gaze traveled down to the gun on her hip and then back up to her face, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a way that was not kind. "Help you with something, ma'am?" he said, and the way he said it suggested he did not actually believe she could be helped, not here, not with something that would require him to take her seriously. Anna looked at him for a moment that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "That is a fine question," she said, "and I will get to you the moment you become relevant." The smile died. The other rancher coughed. The clerk behind the counter pressed his lips together, and she could not tell if he was suppressing a laugh or a grimace. She approached the counter and set down the leather satchel she had carried from the horse, and from it she drew a folded document, a deed and a survey record, and a letter from the county assessor dated 2 months prior, and she laid them out on the counter in a precise and deliberate row. "My name is Anna Winslow," she said. "My husband Thomas Winslow filed a homestead claim in 1875 under the Homestead Act on 320 acres in the Sweetwater Valley, survey .6 miles northeast of the Larson Creek Fork. He died on the 14th of July this year. I am here to transfer the title into my name and to contest the boundary survey that a man named Harlan Reed has filed against the eastern quarter of my land." The clerk, whose name badge read Gerald Fitch, studied the documents. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at her the way people looked at something unexpected, with a mixture of surprise and recalibration. "Mrs. Winslow," he said carefully, "the boundary dispute filed by Mr. Reed was entered into record last month. There will need to be an official survey." "I know that," Anna said. "I am requesting one. I am also requesting that you note for the record that I am contesting Mr. Reed's survey as fraudulent, as I have a copy of the original survey conducted in 1875 which places the eastern boundary marker at the old lightning-struck pine, not 30 yards west of it where Mr. Reed's hired man apparently decided it should be." Gerald Fitch looked at her survey document. He looked at it for a long time. Behind her, the man with the crease in his hat had gone very quiet. "I will need to file this properly," Gerald said. "I expect you to," Anna said. "I will wait." She sat down on the wooden bench near the wall and folded her hands in her lap, and the Colt revolver settled against her thigh with a solid and entirely comfortable weight, and nobody in that room said another word about it. It took Gerald Fitch 40 minutes to process her paperwork. In that time, the two ranchers near the window left without looking at her, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She watched the light change through the dusty window and thought about Thomas, and about the hay still standing in the east field that she had not been able to cut because the second horse had thrown a shoe, and about the winter coming down from the north like a slow, inevitable fact. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She had been born in Ohio in 1851 to a schoolteacher father and a mother who kept chickens and a sharp opinion on every subject, and she had come west with Thomas in 1874 because the idea of the open land had seemed to both of them like a conversation worth having with the world. She was 27 years old now, and she had the sort of face that people called handsome rather than pretty, the kind that improved with trouble rather than crumbling under it. Her hair was dark brown, and she wore it pinned up, though pieces of it had escaped the pins during the morning ride and framed her face in a way she hadn't bothered to fix. When Gerald Fitch finally called her back to the counter, he handed her a receipt of filing and a form acknowledging the contested boundary claim, and he did it with the manner of a man who had quietly revised his initial assessment. "The county surveyor will be in contact within 30 days, he said. "I know the law, Mr. Fitch," she said, but she said it without sharpness. "Thank you for your efficiency." She gathered her papers, replaced them in the satchel, and turned to leave. She was almost to the door when it opened, and a man walked in. He was not remarkable in the way of men who tried to be remarkable. He was tall, a few inches above 6 feet, with dark hair that had been cut recently but not recently enough, and a jaw that carried about 3 days of stubble above a collar that had been cleaned this morning. He wore a brown coat that had seen considerable weather, and carried his hat in his hand, because he had apparently remembered to remove it before entering, which in Anna's experience was not the universal habit of men coming into public buildings in Wyoming territory. He stopped when he saw her coming toward him, and he stepped to the side to let her pass, and he said, "Ma'am," with a nod that was courteous and unremarkable, and asked nothing of her in return for the courtesy. She walked past him and out into the pale October morning. She was untying her horse, a steady bay mare named Cora, when she heard the door of the land office open again behind her. "Mrs. Winslow," she turned. It was the man from the doorway. He stood on the step with his hat still in his hand, and his expression was one of careful uncertainty, as though he was aware that he might be making an error and had decided to proceed anyway. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said. "About the Reed boundary claim." She looked at him. "Most things said in a small room are overheard," she said. "That's the nature of small rooms." "Yes, ma'am." He came down the step. "My name is Daniel Carver. I own the Double C Ranch north of yours, I believe. I bought the old Hendricks place 2 years back." Anna studied him with the directness that had always unnerved people who expected women to look away. "I know the Double C," she said. "You've kept to yourself." "I have," he agreed, and he said it without apology. "I wanted to tell you that I knew Harlan Reed from before I came here, from Colorado. He's not a man who gives up on a claim once he's filed it, even when he's wrong. Especially when he's wrong." "I appreciate the warning," Anna said evenly, though I had already arrived at a similar assessment. "I also wanted to tell you," he said, and here he paused for a half-second, looking down at his hat and then back up at her, "that I have the original survey notes from when the county first platted this valley. My land borders yours on the northwest, and the same surveyor did both our properties. His notes would support your eastern boundary marker." Anna went still. "Thomas," she said carefully, "always said the old lightning pine was the marker. It's in the deed." "But the original survey notes, those were filed with the county office in Rawlins." "The copies were," Daniel said. "But the surveyor, a man named Albright, he gave me his field notebook when I settled my own dispute with a neighbor 2 years ago. He said to keep it because the county office in Rawlins had a habit of losing things that were inconvenient to powerful men." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass and the distant wood smoke of the town. "Mr. Carver," Anna said. "Daniel," he said, and then immediately looked as though he wasn't sure he should have said that. "Daniel," she said, and watched him relax slightly. "Why would you help me with this?" He put his hat on. It suited him, she noticed, in the uncalculated way that things suit people when they have worn them long enough to become part of each other. "Because Harlan Reed is going to try to take your land," he said simply. "And that's not right. And the survey notes are the proof that it's not right. And I've been sitting on them for 2 years because my dispute was settled and I didn't know I'd need them again." He paused. "Also because your husband was a decent man. I traded with him twice for fence post timber. He never short-measured and he never padded the price." Something moved through Anna's chest that she had not felt in 3 months. It was not sorrow and it was not joy. It was something in between, the recognition of simple human decency in a place and time that offered no guarantee of it. "The notes," she said. "Can I see them?" "I'll bring them to you," he said. "Or you're welcome at the Double C any time you want to ride over." She took his measure again. He stood squarely and met her eyes without aggression or performance. He was, she thought, perhaps 28 or 29, and there was nothing in his manner that suggested he was offering the survey notes in exchange for anything other than the offering itself. "I'll ride over Thursday," she said, "if that suits." "Thursday suits fine," he said. She mounted Cora and turned the mare toward the road south. She did not look back, but she heard him standing there for a moment before the door of the land office opened and closed again, and she found herself thinking, for the first time in 3 months, about something other than survival. The ride back to her ranch took 2 hours, and she spent them well. She cataloged what needed doing. The hay had to be cut before the next rain. The fence along the south pasture had 2 broken posts she'd been meaning to replace for weeks. The root cellar needed to be checked because she'd seen mouse sign near the entrance, and a Wyoming winter with a compromised root cellar was not a situation she intended to be in. The ranch came into view as the afternoon light started to go golden, and she felt the way she always felt when she saw it, a complicated mixture of love and grief, and the particular stubborn determination of someone who has committed to a thing and means to see it through. The house was small but solid, built of logs Thomas had cut himself with her help, chinked with clay and straw, with a real glass window in the front room that Thomas had hauled all the way from Rawlins on a wagon, packed in sawdust. The barn was red-painted, though the paint was weathering now. There was a garden plot long since harvested, the earth turned over and dark. There was a chicken coop, and from within it came the usual sounds of chickens engaging in whatever chickens found to occupy their attention. She unsaddled Cora, brushed her down, and fed her. She fed the 3 remaining cattle and checked their water. She fed the chickens and collected 6 eggs. She brought in wood for the stove and started a fire and made herself a supper of salt pork and boiled potatoes, and the last of the bread she'd baked on Monday. She ate alone at the table Thomas had built, in the chair that faced the door, and she thought about the survey notes in Daniel Carver's possession, and about Harlan Reed's filed claim, and about the winter, and about everything that needed to happen before the snow came. She did not let herself think about the way Daniel Carver had said Thursday suits fine. She was practical enough to know that grief made people susceptible to small kindnesses, and she was too experienced with her own heart to mistake need for feeling. But Thursday, she would ride to the Double C. The morning she rode north to Daniel Carver's ranch, the sky was the deep clear blue of a Wyoming October, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had come west at all. It was the sky of possibility, of distances so large they rearranged your sense of what was permanent and what was merely temporary. The Double C was a more established property than hers. The house was larger, also log-built but with a covered porch running its full width, and there was a second barn that appeared newer than the first. The fencing was in good repair. There was a kitchen garden, the beds mulched deep for winter. Someone had planted a row of young cottonwoods along the north side of the house as a windbreak, and they had grown enough to be doing their job. A man was splitting wood in the yard when she rode in. He set down his axe and straightened, and she saw that it was Daniel, and that he had apparently been at it for a while because his coat was off despite the cool, and his sleeves were rolled. He raised a hand in greeting and came to meet her as she dismounted. "Mrs. Winslow," he said. "Anna," she said, because if she was going to tell him what to call her, she might as well do it directly. He looked at her for a moment. "Anna," he said. He said it as though he was making a decision, which she supposed he was. He tied Cora to the post and took her inside, and the inside of his house was clean in the way of a man who kept things orderly out of personal preference rather than expectation of company. There was a stone fireplace with a good fire going, a table with 4 chairs, shelves of books, which surprised her, more books than she would have expected. A rifle hung above the door. The floor was swept. On the table he had already laid out the surveyor's field notebook, open to the relevant pages. She sat down and he sat across from her, and she read through the notes with the careful attention she'd given everything since Thomas's death, which was to say she read them as though each line might contain something essential. And they did. The surveyor, Albright, had been meticulous. His notes described the lightning-struck pine by name, by diameter, by the number of paces north from the Larson Creek Fork. They described the bearing of the eastern boundary line with compass notations. They described, in the dry language of a man concerned with precision, exactly where Anna's land ended and where empty territory began, and it was exactly where Thomas had always said. "This is clear," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "Reed's surveyor put the marker 30 yards west, which takes in about 40 acres of your best river-bottom land," Daniel said. "That's your winter grazing." She looked at him. "You know my property." "I know this valley," he said. "I've ridden every inch of it. When you own land, you need to know what's around you." He paused. "Also, I'll be honest with you. When Thomas died and I heard you were staying on, I paid attention to your situation because it seemed like one I might need to be aware of." "You were watching my ranch?" she asked, and her tone was level, not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Not watching," he said carefully. "Paying attention, there's a difference. I wanted to know if there was trouble so I could be useful." He stopped. "That probably sounds presumptuous." "It sounds considerate," she said after a moment, "which is not a thing I've had a surplus of lately." He stood and went to the stove and poured coffee into 2 cups and brought them back. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The coffee was strong and bitter and exactly what she needed. "Tell me about Reed," she said. Daniel sat back down. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, thinking about where to start. "He came up from Colorado about 4 years ago," Daniel said. "Had land down there, too, more than he needed, and a habit of acquiring more by filing adjacent claims and then contesting boundaries. He's good at it. He finds a widow or a man who's struggling, he files a counter-survey, and he buries them in paperwork until they either settle or give up." He looked at her steadily. "He's never met a woman who showed up to the land office wearing a gun." "He hasn't met me at all," Anna said. Daniel's mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "No," he said, "he has not." They talked for 2 hours. About the survey, about the legal process, about the county surveyor who would need to be brought in, about the witnesses who could attest to the original boundary marker. Daniel knew the area and the law with the thoroughness of someone who had needed both for his own protection, and Anna found herself adjusting her understanding of him as the conversation went on. He had come from Missouri originally, he told her, when she asked. He'd worked cattle in Kansas and Colorado before buying the Hendricks place. He'd had a partner once, a man named Ware, but Ware had gone back east 2 years ago and left him the land and the name. He was 30 years old, she estimated, though she didn't ask. He had been in Wyoming long enough to have opinions about the county commissioners and the railroad companies, and the way the big cattle operations were using their legal resources to press smaller homesteaders toward the margins. "You sound like my husband," she said at one point. He went still for just a moment. "Was that a good thing to sound like?" "It was," she said. Thomas believed in fairness the way some people believe in religion, as a practical daily matter. "He was right too," Daniel said. She looked at the fire for a moment. He was right about most things, she said quietly. That made him easy to love and occasionally very difficult to argue with. Daniel said nothing, which was, she thought, the correct response. She left in the early afternoon with the surveyor's notebook, which Daniel lent to her without being asked, telling her to keep it as long as she needed it. She rode back south through the golden afternoon, and something in her chest felt slightly different than it had that morning. Not lighter exactly, but differently arranged. October moved toward November with the intentional slow march of the season. Anna cut the hay with a borrowed scythe from her neighbor to the south, a Scandinavian woman named Ingrid Bjorn, who had her own homestead and her own opinions, and who came over twice to help with the cutting, and stayed for supper both times and made Anna feel less alone than she'd felt in months. Ingrid was 42 and had buried a husband herself, 7 years back, and she had the particular wisdom of someone who had rebuilt her life from materials that were not ideal. "The land office man," Ingrid said one evening over cornbread and coffee. "The one to the north." "Daniel Carver," Anna said. "He lent me the survey notes." "I know who he is," Ingrid said. "I have seen him. He is not bad to look at for a Missourian." "I hadn't noticed," Anna said, which was not entirely true. "You had noticed," Ingrid said serenely. "You are a practical woman, Anna, not a blind one." Anna cut another piece of cornbread and did not argue the point. The county surveyor came out in the third week of October, a precise man named Morrison who wore spectacles and brought his own equipment and took no opinions from either party about where the boundary ought to be. He surveyed from the Larson Creek Fork north along the existing fence line and spent the better part of an afternoon taking measurements and making notes. Daniel came down from the Double C to be present, which Anna had not asked him to do. He arrived on a gray horse she hadn't seen before and stood to the side during the surveying, not inserting himself but available. And when the surveyor had a question about the historical notes from Albright's field notebook, Daniel answered it from memory because he had apparently committed the relevant pages to mind. Morrison recorded his findings, told them both that the report would be filed with the county within 15 days, and packed up his equipment and left. Anna and Daniel stood on either side of the fence line in the cooling afternoon. "He confirmed the pine," Daniel said. "He confirmed the pine," Anna agreed. The lightning-struck tree stood 40 yards to their east, a massive old ponderosa that had been hit years ago and had partially healed, leaving a scar that ran down its south face like a long, pale wound. "Reed will contest it," Daniel said. "Of course he will," Anna said, "but he'll contest it with less ground to stand on than he had before." She looked at the tree. She thought about Thomas planting the fence post in this very spot, pressing the bar into the earth, saying to her, "Right here, Anna, this is ours right here." She was quiet for a moment, and Daniel was quiet beside her, and it was a companionable quiet, the kind that didn't ask anything of either of them. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "I know," he said, "but you did." "I did." She looked at him sideways. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the hills to the west, turning them a deep amber gold that was almost too beautiful to look at directly, the kind of beauty that made you feel briefly and almost painfully aware of being alive. "I'm going to win this," she said. It was not a question. "I believe you are," he said, and his voice had the texture of someone who meant what they were saying completely. November came in cold and bright, the first hard frosts coating the grass in the mornings with a white that burned off by 10 o'clock. Anna spent her mornings in the barn with her 2 remaining cattle and Cora, keeping them warm and watered and fed, and her afternoons keeping the house maintained against the cold that was building in the north. Daniel came by twice that month, and each time he brought something. Once it was a haunch of venison from a deer he'd taken, and once it was 2 fence posts he said he had extra of, which she suspected was a generous reinterpretation of the word extra. She fed him supper both times because it would have been rude not to, and because she found, if she was honest with herself, that she liked having someone at the table. He was not a man who filled silence with noise. He talked when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't, and she appreciated this because she was the same way. They talked about the land and the weather and the probable direction of the railroad spur that the county commissioners had been arguing about for 2 years. They talked about the cattle market and about the Indian Territory to the south, and about the treaty conditions that the Arapaho and Shoshone were living under on the reservation to the north, and he talked about these things with a matter-of-factness that acknowledged the injustice of the displacement without performing outrage or indifference. The land was theirs, he said simply, one evening. It was, Anna said. And it was taken by fraud and force and paper signing by people who had the power to make paper signing mean something. He stirred his coffee. I think about that sometimes, the difference between legal and right. Thomas thought about that too, Anna said. He looked at her, and she noticed that he did not flinch any more when she mentioned Thomas. In the first weeks, she had seen a brief hesitation in him, as if he wasn't sure whether the mention of her husband was something he should respond to or step around. But he had settled into it, and she respected him for that. "Do you mind," he said one evening, near the end of November, "if I ask you something that may not be my business?" "I mind very little these days," she said. "Life is short, as it turns out." He almost smiled. "Did you always want to stay, even after Thomas died? There was never a question of going back to Ohio." She thought about it seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "No," she said. "No question, this land is mine. I helped clear it. I planted on it. I buried my husband on it." She paused. "And Ohio is 1,700 miles away and has nothing for me anymore. My parents have been gone 10 years. My sister married a man in Cincinnati who is exactly as dull as he sounds." She looked at the fire. "This is where I am. This is where I intend to remain." He nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "I feel the same about the double C. When you build something, you don't walk away from it because it gets hard." "No," she said, "you don't." The silence settled between them, warm and undemanding. The county surveyor's report came back in the second week of November. It confirmed the original boundary marker at the lightning-struck pine, which meant that Harlan Reed's survey was found to be in error. The eastern quarter of Anna's land remained hers. Gerald Fitch wrote her a formal letter, which she read twice standing in the cold beside the road where the mail rider had left it, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in her coat pocket and walked back to the barn where Cora was waiting, and she leaned her forehead against the mare's warm neck for a moment and breathed. She rode to the Double C the next morning. She found Daniel in the near pasture checking on his cattle, a small winter herd of 12 that stood in the frost-bitten grass with their breath making clouds in the cold air. He saw her coming and waited. She pulled up beside him and held up the letter. He read it. He looked at her. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the notes, for coming to the survey, for all of it." He shook his head. "It was your land." "It was," she said, "but you helped make sure it stayed that way." He handed the letter back. Their fingers touched briefly in the transfer, just the edges of bare hands in the cold morning air, and she felt it with a specificity that surprised her. She tucked the letter back in her pocket. He turned his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed he did when he was thinking carefully about something. "Reed may not accept it," he said. "I know," she said, "but if he files a challenge to the county report, it goes to the territorial court. And the territorial court will have Albright's field notes and Morrison's survey and 3 witnesses to the original boundary marker." She paused. "He won't win." "No," Daniel agreed. "He won't." She looked out over his land, the winter pasture rolling away to the north, the ridgeline dark with pine against the blue sky. It was beautiful country. She had never been sorry for a moment that she'd come here. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly." He looked at her steadily. "All right. Why did you involve yourself?" she asked. "You could have kept the survey notes and minded your business, and Reed wouldn't have had any reason to bother you. You had nothing to gain." He was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved slowly through the frost. The wind moved the grass. "I had a neighbor in Colorado," he said. "A man named Greer had a wife and 2 daughters." He was a good farmer but not a good businessman, and when times were tight, a man came in and filed adjacent claims and buried him in paperwork, and Greer gave up and left. He looked at the ridgeline. "It didn't help. I thought it wasn't my affair." He paused. "I've thought about that affair amount since." Anna studied him. There was no performance in what he'd said. He was not trying to present himself as noble. He was trying to explain a fact about himself that he found uncomfortable. "You were not responsible for what happened to Greer," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I might have prevented it. There is a difference between those two things." She nodded. She understood that difference very well. She'd been navigating it since July. "Well," she said, "your conscience and I are both grateful." He looked at her then, and something moved in his expression that was different from anything she'd seen in him before. Something unguarded and complicated and entirely human. "Anna," he said. "Daniel," she said. They looked at each other in the cold morning air with the cattle moving behind him and the sky enormous and blue overhead, and it was one of those moments that is what it is completely, without needing to be dressed up or apologized for. "I would like," he said carefully, "to continue being your neighbor if that is agreeable." "It is very agreeable," she said. "And perhaps more than your neighbor," he said more quietly. "Eventually, when you're ready for more than that. If that is ever something you would consider." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about the love that had been full and real and ended before she had expected it to. She thought about the land and about the survey letter in her pocket and about Ingrid Bjorn telling her she was a practical woman, not a blind one. "I am not ready today," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "But I think," she said, "that today is not the same as never." He looked at her with the same directness she always looked at him with, and for a moment they were simply two people standing in a cold field acknowledging that the world had more possibility in it than either of them had recently expected. "That is enough," he said. "More than enough." She turned Cora south and rode home, and the letter sat warm in her pocket, and she thought about many things at once, and none of them were grief. December arrived with a blizzard that kept her inside for 4 days. The snow packed against the north wall of the house to window height, and the temperature dropped to places that made every breath a small visible event. She kept the stove burning through the nights and moved the chickens into the barn and banked the root cellar door with straw bales and read the 3 books she had by the fire until she had read each of them twice. On the 5th morning the sky was clear, and the world was white and absolute and beautiful in the way that only appears after something violent has passed. She found a note nailed to her gate post, which meant someone had been out in the storm, which meant someone had considerable determination. The note was written in a hand she was starting to recognize. It said, "Blizzard came in harder than expected. Are you well, D.C.?" She stood in the snow with the note and felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She wrote back on the reverse side of the paper, "I am well. Root cellar intact." Cora irritated about the barn arrangement. She folded it and rode it up to the double C fence line and nailed it to his gate post, and rode back in the white morning feeling foolish and not caring about it at all. His response arrived the following morning at her gate. It said, "Tell Cora that horses who complain about adequate shelter are not asked their opinion. I hope the chickens are less ungrateful." She laughed, alone in the cold morning beside her fence post, and the sound of it surprised her a little. It had been a while since she'd heard herself laugh. January deepened. The notes became a habit, then a thing they both apparently looked forward to, then something that functioned as a kind of conversation without the formality of arranging meetings. He wrote about the cattle and the fencing, and once about a book he was reading. She wrote about the chickens and the weather, and once about a dream she'd had about Ohio that left her feeling unsettled. He wrote back, "I sometimes dream about Kansas City, which I never liked, and I wake up grateful to be here." She wrote back, "Is gratitude always the thing on the other side of bad dreams?" He wrote, "I think it can be. I think that might be what they're for." She read that in the late afternoon by the window, with the winter light going orange and the snow deep outside and the fire crackling behind her, and she thought that she did not know yet what the shape of her life going forward would look like, but she thought it might involve this particular voice, in whatever form it came. Harlan Reed made one more attempt in January. He hired a lawyer from Cheyenne who sent Anna a letter full of legal language disputing the county surveyor's findings and suggesting that the matter be settled privately, which meant, she understood, that she should agree to cede the eastern quarter in exchange for Reed dropping his counterclaim. She wrote back herself, without a lawyer, which she couldn't afford in any case, citing the specific findings of the county surveyor and the original survey notes and informing Mr. Reed's counsel that she would be delighted to resolve the matter in territorial court if they wished to proceed, and that she had documentation sufficient to make the proceeding both brief and embarrassing for their client. She showed the exchange to Daniel the next time she saw him, which was in late January when he rode down to help her with a calf that had been born in the worst week of weather and needed extra attention. He read the lawyer's letter and her response and looked at her over the papers with an expression she was beginning to find very dear. "Did you practice law in a previous life?" he asked. "My father was a schoolteacher who believed in clear reasoning," she said. "He used to give us arguments to deconstruct at the supper table. My sister hated it." "What did you think?" "I won most of the time," she said, "so I liked it very much." His face did the thing it had been doing more frequently lately, the thing that was entirely a smile without the constraint he'd started with. It changed his whole face, that smile, the way good weather changes a landscape. She looked away before it could do anything more than please her. The calf did well. They named it, which she knew was a practical mistake, and did it anyway. She called it Treaty because of the survey, and Daniel said that was a fine name for a calf born out of a boundary dispute. February thawed slightly and then refroze and then thawed again, the way Wyoming Februaries did, teasing at spring before pulling the cold back like a tablecloth. Anna's cattle survived the winter well. She had lost no chickens, which was a small miracle. The root cellar held and the hay lasted. She began to feel cautiously like someone who was going to be all right. Not the same. She would not be the same as before Thomas died, and she did not want to pretend that she would be. But something that was recognizably a life, full and purposeful and not without joy, that seemed within reach. On a Sunday in late February when the sun came out strong and the snow was melting from the south-facing slopes, Daniel came to her door without sending a note first. She was in the yard when he rode up, mending a piece of fence that the winter had stressed. He dismounted and tied his horse and came to stand near her, and he watched her work for a moment without speaking. "You're good at that," he said. "I've had practice," she said. "Thomas always said I fenced straighter than he did." Was he right? "Almost certainly," she said, "but he was better at everything else, so it balanced." She finished the post and stepped back to look at it, good and solid. She dusted her hands on her work trousers, which she wore on days when she was doing things that required practicality, and turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, or perhaps she had seen it and not let herself name it until now. There was something in it that was careful and certain at once, the expression of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has arrived at a conclusion. "I would like to take you to supper in Sweetwater," he said. "When the roads are clear enough for a wagon, if you're willing." Sweetwater was the nearest town, 14 miles south. It had a hotel that served meals in its front room on Saturday evenings that were called supper and were moderately civilized. She looked at him for a long moment. She was 27 years old and had been widowed 7 months ago, and had been surviving every day since then with a combination of stubbornness and practical intelligence, and the occasional conversation through gate-post notes with the tall man currently standing in her yard asking her to supper. "Yes," she said. "I think I would like that." He breathed out. She hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. "Saturday, if the roads allow," he said. "Saturday," she said. He stayed for an hour and helped her with 2 more fence posts, and she appreciated that he didn't suddenly become awkward or formal about it. He was the same as he always was, which was steady and direct and occasionally amusing, and she thought that this was probably the most reliable sign of a person's character. Not how they behaved when they were trying to impress you, but how they behaved when the question of impressing you had been answered. The roads were passable on Saturday, cold but clear, the packed snow providing firm footing for the horses. He came for her in the late afternoon with a wagon that had been cleaned of its usual working debris, and a coat that was newer than the one she'd seen on him before. She wore the blue wool dress she'd brought from Ohio, which still fit and which she hadn't worn since Thomas's funeral, and she decided that wearing it to something other than grief was a step in the right direction. He helped her up into the wagon, and they drove the 14 miles into Sweetwater with the winter sky deepening overhead and the stars coming out one by one. The hotel was warm and yellow-lit and smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Holt, seated them at a corner table and brought them beef stew and biscuits and strong tea, and they sat across from each other in the candlelight and talked. They talked about their childhoods, seriously and without performance, two people who had arrived at lives they hadn't originally planned and were trying to understand the path that had led them here. He had grown up poor in Missouri, he told her, the son of a man who worked the river trade and a mother who had died when he was 12, and he had left at 17 with the intention of becoming something, and had spent a decade becoming something unspecified before arriving at the Double C. She told him about Ohio and her father's schoolroom and the particular feeling of reading a great deal as a child, and then stepping out of books into a world that was simultaneously more interesting and more difficult than any of them. She told him about meeting Thomas at 19, at a church social that she had attended only because her mother insisted, and how Thomas had argued with her about something within 10 minutes of introduction, and how she'd known immediately that she was going to love him. Daniel listened to all of this with an attentiveness that was neither pitying nor jealous, and she was grateful for both absences. "You loved him very much," he said. "I did," she said. "I still do in whatever way you still love someone who is gone. It doesn't stop, it just changes shape." He nodded. "I understand that," he said. "Or I think I'm starting to." She looked at him. "Have you lost someone?" He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman," he said, "in Kansas. A long time ago. She didn't die. She chose someone else." He looked at his hands. "I think what I mean is that I understand how a feeling doesn't stop just because the circumstances change." "And did it change shape?" Anna asked. "It did," he said. "Eventually, it took longer than I would have liked." He looked up at her. "But it did." They walked back to the wagon under a sky full of winter stars, walking close together in the cold without touching. He handed her up into the seat and drove them home through the dark, and they talked less on the return journey, comfortable in the quiet. When he pulled up to her gate, he handed her down from the wagon, and she stood on the cold ground looking up at him. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said. She was close enough to see his face clearly in the starlight, and she could see the question in it that he was not asking, and she appreciated that he was not asking it, that he was letting her set the pace of whatever this was. She put her hand briefly on his arm through the coat and felt the solid warmth of him. "Come for supper Tuesday," she said. "I'll make proper food, not just salt pork." He smiled, and even in the dark she could see it clearly. "I'll bring the bread," he said. "I bake reasonably well for a rancher." She went inside and listened to the sound of his wagon wheels on the frozen road, diminishing north, and she stood in her warm kitchen with the fire banked low, and felt the particular tenderness of a moment that has been right. Spring came to the Sweetwater Valley the way spring always came, tentatively at first and then all at once, green arriving in the creek bottoms first and spreading uphill over the weeks until the whole landscape was vivid and new. The calves were born and the garden was turned over and planted, and Anna spent her days in the productive rhythm of a ranch that was going to survive, that was in fact thriving. She and Daniel settled into a companionship that deepened by degrees through March and April. Each degree arrived at naturally and without forcing. He came to supper on Tuesdays. She rode to the Double C on Thursdays to help plan what their respective spring planting schedules could share, since it made sense to combine trips to town and to split the cost of seed orders. In April, on a warm afternoon when the hills were fully green and the creek was running high with snowmelt, he kissed her. They had been checking a section of fence that ran along the boundary between their two properties, a new fence that Daniel had proposed and she had agreed to, and they had spent 3 Saturdays building together. The fence was a practical matter, but it was also, they both understood, something more than practical. It was the establishment of a shared boundary. It was two people deciding to be adjacent to each other deliberately and permanently. He had been standing close to her, pointing out where they might extend the line toward the creek next season, and she had turned to look in the direction he was indicating, and when she turned back his face was very near hers, and he was watching her with that expression she had learned to read, certain and careful together. She kissed him, or he kissed her. In the moment it was impossible to determine, and afterward it seemed irrelevant. It was brief and warm and specific, and when it was over they stood on the hillside in the April afternoon with the smell of new grass all around them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Anna said. "Well," Daniel agreed. She looked at the fence line stretching away toward the creek. It was good work, straight and solid, it would last. "That was not the worst thing that's ever happened to me on a fence line," she said. He laughed, an actual laugh, real and warm, and she felt it like sunlight. "I should hope not," he said. She put her hand in his, which she had not done before, and they walked back along the fence toward the horses, and the spring afternoon held them both with an ease that felt like something that had been building for a long time finally arriving at its right and proper place. May was extraordinary. The valley was green and the sky was full of hawks riding the thermals over the ridgelines, and Anna's garden came up strong, and Treaty the calf grew into a vigorous young steer that had no idea he owed his name to a land dispute. She had 3 cattle now, including 2 new calves, and the herd was small but growing, and the ranch felt like a living thing moving forward in time the way she had promised it would. Harlan Reed's lawyer sent one final letter in May. It was terse and somewhat deflated, notifying her that Mr. Reed had withdrawn his boundary claim against her property. She read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee, and then set it face down and looked out the window at the garden for a long moment. She felt satisfaction, clean and complete. She felt the particular solidity of having fought for something, and won it by being right and being prepared and being stubborn enough to outlast someone who had expected her to fold. She also felt the absence of Thomas, which was always there but sometimes louder than others, and she let herself feel it without pushing it away, because that was how you carried grief properly, not denying it but giving it its place and then going on. When Daniel came for supper that evening, she showed him the letter. He read it and looked at her, and his face did everything she'd come to love about it, that uncalculated openness that was not performed for her but simply existed. "It's over," he said. "It's over," she agreed. He set the letter down on the table and looked at her, and the kitchen was warm and the evening light was coming in gold through the window, and she could hear the chickens settling for the night outside, and something about the moment felt like an arrival, like a thing that had been in motion had finally come to rest. "Anna," he said. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. He was very still in the way he got when something mattered to him considerably. "I want to ask if you would consider marrying me," he said. "Not soon if you need time, but eventually, as a direction we are going." She looked at him across the table. She thought about the notes on the gate post and the supper in Sweetwater and the fence they had built together, and the April afternoon on the hillside and every Tuesday evening and every Thursday morning, and the surveyor's field notebook that was still on her shelf and the letter from Reed's lawyer face down on the table and the gun on her hip that had been Thomas's and all the miles of road she had ridden since July. "I would consider it," she said. "I have in fact been considering it." "And," he said. "And I think the answer is yes," she said, "when we're both ready and when the time is right." He stood up from the table and came around it, which was something he'd never done before, with that kind of intention. And she stood up too, because she knew what was coming and she wanted to meet it on her feet. And he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that did not reduce itself to timidity. And he kissed her the way he'd been wanting to for longer than either of them had said. She kissed him back the way she'd been wanting to for longer than she'd admitted. They were married in September of 1879, 11 months after Anna first walked into the Sweetwater County Land Office. The ceremony was held at the small church in Sweetwater, performed by the circuit minister who came through the territory 4 times a year. Ingrid Bjorn stood as witness and wore her best dress and cried without apology. Gerald Fitch attended, which surprised Anna, but she supposed he'd earned the right to see how the story turned out. Anna wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself over the summer, with buttons she'd ordered specially from the catalog, and she wore Thomas's gun on her hip over the dress because she was a practical woman, and because 14 miles of road through Wyoming territory required a practical woman to be armed even on her wedding day, and because the gun was part of her now in a way she didn't need to explain to anyone. Daniel wore his good coat and a new shirt, and a tie that he'd apparently borrowed from someone because it did not quite suit him, and he seemed slightly uncomfortable about it, which made her love him more. They stood before the minister and said the words, and the light came through the church windows and fell across them both, and Anna felt the full weight of the moment, everything it contained, grief and love and time and the particular courage required to open your heart again after it's been broken, and she felt steady in it, which was exactly right. She became Anna Carver on record, though she kept Winslow in daily life for the land records where it was necessary, and Daniel understood this and never questioned it. They celebrated with a supper at the hotel, a larger group now, Ingrid and Gerald Fitch and 2 of Daniel's ranch hands who came respectfully cleaned up, and Mrs. Holt outdid herself with a roast and 3 kinds of pie. They drove home in the September night, the wagon rolling north along the familiar road, and the sky was enormous and full of stars, and she sat close beside him with his arm around her and his warmth solid against her side. When they came to the fork where the road split between her land and his, he turned the horses toward the double C. "We discussed this," she said. "We did," he said. "My house is the better house for 2 people," she said. "Your house is the smaller house," he said. "My house has the better view," she said. "My house has the larger barn," he said. This was the argument they'd been having for 2 months. Neither house was obviously superior. Both had things to recommend them. The practical solution, which they had arrived at slowly and then embraced, was that they would live between both, which was possible because the properties shared a long boundary and were less than a mile apart, and were going to be operated together as one holding. But they had agreed to spend their first nights in the house they had not started in, to establish new territory in the shared geography of their life. "We said we would use the double C first," he reminded her. "You said that," she said. "You agreed." "I may have been distracted at the time," she said. He looked at her with that full smile, and she felt it go all the way through her. "You were not distracted," he said. "You never are." She settled closer against his side. "All right," she said. The double C, he pulled her closer and clicked the horses on, and the road rolled north under the September stars. The first year of their marriage was full to the edges with things to do and decide and build. They combined their operations gradually, moving cattle between the 2 properties as the grazing required, planting a shared kitchen garden that was twice the size of either of their individual gardens and twice as productive. They hired a hand named Eli, a young man of 22 from Texas who was quiet and competent, and had the good sense not to comment on Anna's management of the cattle end of things, which she ran with a directness that took him some weeks to adjust to. She kept wearing the gun. Daniel had never once asked her to put it away, which told her more about him than most of the conversations they'd had. She carried it because the land was still sometimes hard and sometimes dangerous, and because it was hers now in a way that had become entirely separate from grief. It was part of how she moved through the world. It was a statement she'd been making since July of 1878 and saw no reason to stop making. In the winter of their first year, when the nights were long and they had settled into the particular domestic life of two people who have found their rhythm together, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen of her house, which was now their house too, the house where Thomas had built the table and put in the glass window, the house she had kept and fought for and made her own. She told him directly, because she did not know another way to say important things. He was very still for a moment, and then he stood and came to her and held her with a care that was also full of joy, and she felt his breath in her hair and his arms around her and the solid warmth of someone who was going to be here for this. "Are you well?" he asked, which was his first question, not a question about the baby but about her. "I'm very well," she said. "I'm healthier than I've been in years." "Good," he said. And she could hear everything he was feeling in that one word, all of it, the wonder and the love and the careful reverence for her. Their son was born in August of 1880, in the house with the glass window and the table Thomas had built, delivered by Ingrid Bjorn and a doctor who came from Sweetwater, and he arrived in the world with a full set of opinions expressed loudly and immediately, which Anna found deeply reassuring. They named him Thomas Daniel Carver, and if Daniel had any feelings about the Thomas part, he never expressed anything other than pride. Thomas Daniel was a solid, serious baby who looked, by the time he was 3 months old, entirely like Daniel except for the dark eyes he had from Anna. He was brought into the world of the ranch from his earliest weeks, carried in a sling across Anna's chest while she did the morning rounds, lulled by the sounds of cattle and the smell of hay and the voices of his parents moving around him. He would grow up, Anna thought, knowing exactly where he came from and what it had cost to build, which was the best possible inheritance she could give him. Harlan Reed left the county in the spring of 1881, which Anna heard about from Gerald Fitch during a trip to file the new combined land record for the Winslow Carver holding. Fitch reported it with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has watched a story resolve correctly. "He's gone to Nebraska," Fitch said. "I understand the climate there suits him better." The climate here, Anna said, had certain disadvantages for men of his particular disposition. Fitch allowed himself a small smile. "It did," he said. "It had a number of those." The combined property, which they now called the Winslow Carver Ranch on all official documents because both names were in the land records and it was important to honor both, grew steadily through the early 1880s. Eli stayed on and they hired a second hand, a man named Santiago who had come north from New Mexico and who had a way with horses that went beyond skill into something closer to conversation. Daniel bought 2 more cattle in the fall of 1881, and Anna's original herd, including Treaty the steer who was now enormous and apparently immortal, had grown to 12 head. They extended the fence line along the eastern boundary all the way to the creek, the fence they had started building before they were married, completing it in the autumn of 1881 as a kind of anniversary celebration. They stood on the finished fence line in the October afternoon, 3 years almost to the day from when Anna had first ridden into the Sweetwater County Land Office, with her dead husband's gun on her hip and her survey documents in her satchel, and the absolute intention of keeping what was hers. Thomas Daniel was 14 months old and had just started walking, and Daniel carried him on his hip while they inspected the fence, and the baby grabbed at Daniel's hat with the proprietary confidence of someone who had never considered that anything in his immediate world might be other than his to reach for. "This is a good fence," Anna said. "It is," Daniel agreed. He rescued his hat from the baby, who immediately reached for it again. "It took us 3 years," she said. "Some things take 3 years," he said. "Some things take longer." She looked out over the land. The afternoon light was doing what it always did in October, turning everything gold and amber and brief, the kind of beauty that made you feel both the pleasure of it and the awareness that it was passing. But that was what beauty was, she thought. Not the permanence of it, but the full attention you brought to it while it was here. I think about that day, she said. The land office. I know you do, he said. So do I. The look on that man's face, she said, when I sat down. He was an idiot, Daniel said, with the serene directness of a settled opinion. He was a man who hadn't considered the possibility, she said, which is a kind of idiocy, yes. The baby had given up on the hat and had fixed his attention on the fence post, pressing his small palm against the wood with an exploratory seriousness that Anna found entirely endearing. He is going to love this land, Daniel said, looking at his son. He's going to love it and work it and fight for it if he needs to, Anna said. That's the deal you make with a piece of ground. You commit to it and it gives back. That's also the deal you make with a person, Daniel said. She looked at him. He was watching Thomas Daniel examine the fence post with an expression of complete and uncomplicated love, and then he turned that same expression on her, and it was so unguarded and so full that she felt it in her chest the way you feel certain things, the way you feel the first warm day of spring or the sound of rain on a roof when you've been dry for too long. Daniel, she said. Anna, he said. She moved close to him, and he put his arm around her, and Thomas Daniel transferred his attention to her coat buttons with the single-minded focus of someone who had found a new project, and the three of them stood on the fence line in the October afternoon, with the whole valley spread out below them and the sky enormous above them. She still had the gun. She still wore it most days when she rode out, when she went to town, when she needed to be reminded that she was a woman who had come through something and come out the other side with everything that mattered still in her possession. It was Thomas's gun and it was hers, and those two facts had stopped being contradictions a long time ago. She thought about him sometimes, in the mornings before the ranch woke up, when she stood at the glass window Thomas had hauled from Rawlins and watched the light come over the hills. She thought about him with love and with gratitude, and with the particular sorrow that does not diminish so much as it deepens into something that is almost its own kind of richness. He had loved this land and he had loved her, and he had done his best by both, and she honored that by staying and thriving. And then the day would begin, and there would be Daniel coming in from the barn with hay on his coat and strong opinions about the fence repair needed on the north line, and Thomas Daniel demanding breakfast with the imperious certainty of a healthy 14-month-old, and Eli bringing the horses in, and Santiago's voice carrying from the corral, where he was working with the young bay they'd gotten in September, and the chickens raising their usual opinions about the state of their food supply, and the whole living, breathing, working thing that a ranch is when it is going right. Their second child came in the spring of 1883, a daughter they named Clara June Carver, born on an April morning when the green was coming back to the valley, and the creek was running full with snowmelt. Clara was loud and decided from the first moment, and by the time she was 2 months old she had established that she was the sort of person who would tell you exactly what she wanted and expected you to act accordingly, and Anna thought that this was an excellent quality for a girl to start with. Thomas Daniel, 3 years old now, regarded his sister with the cautious fascination of someone who has been presented with a mystery. He was a quiet child, observant, already following Daniel around the ranch with the fixed attention of someone taking detailed notes. He would hold the bucket while Daniel fed the cattle. He would sit on the fence and watch Santiago work with the horses. He would stand beside Anna while she worked in the garden, pressing his small hands into the dirt with the same exploring seriousness he'd shown at the fence post when he was a baby. He was going to be a rancher, that much was clear. He had already decided it. Nobody had suggested it to him. He had simply looked at the life around him and known it was his. Clara, Daniel said once with great affection, was going to be a lawyer. Or a judge, Anna said. The judge of everything, Daniel agreed. Life on the Winslow Carver ranch in the middle 1880s had the quality of something that had been built right, that was solid in its foundations, and therefore free to grow without constant structural anxiety. They had 20 cattle by 1884. They had expanded the barn on the double C side. They had put a new roof on the house with the glass window, and Anna had added a proper lean-to kitchen on the back that made the winter cooking considerably more comfortable. Eli married a woman from Sweetwater named Rose who came to the ranch and helped with Clara during the busiest seasons, and became a friend to Anna in the particular way of women who live close to each other and share real work. Santiago stayed on and became, over time, part of the fabric of the place, someone the children called by his first name and fought to sit beside at the supper table. The land itself rewarded them. The river-bottom grass on the eastern quarter, the land that Harlan Reed had tried to take, was the best winter grazing they had. The cattle came through winter lean but healthy every year because of that pasture. It was the piece of land that had been most contested, and it was the piece of land most essential to them, which Anna found satisfying in a way that she did not need to explain to anyone but which Daniel understood completely. The lightning-struck pine still stood. It was older now, further healed, the pale scar down its south face less stark than it had been when the surveyors came to look at it. But it was still there, the old tree, marking the boundary between what was theirs and what was not, as solid and stubborn as the woman who had defended it. In the fall of 1886, Anna rode to Sweetwater to file the annual land tax payment and to pick up supplies and the mail. Daniel was back at the ranch with a fence repair that needed doing before winter, and the children were with him. She went alone, as she had gone alone many times, Cora's successor, a sturdy roan she'd named Abel, carrying her south through the October morning. She tied Abel outside the land office and went in, and Gerald Fitch was still behind the counter, older now, the ink stains on his fingers permanent as they had ever been. "Mrs. Carver," he said, which was how most people in Sweetwater knew her now. "Mr. Fitch," she said. She set her payment on the counter and he began the paperwork. There was a new young clerk in the back of the office, a boy of perhaps 20 who had apparently recently arrived in the territory and was still in the process of calibrating his expectations. He was looking at Anna with the bright curiosity of someone who has heard a story and is now seeing the subject of it in person. "You're the one," he said, and then immediately seemed to realize he'd spoken aloud. She looked at him. "I am generally one of something," she said. "Which particular one did you have in mind?" He went slightly red. "The woman who," he started, "who came in here with the gun and the survey papers and Fitch was telling me about the Reed claim and how you handled it." He glanced at Gerald Fitch, who was looking at his paperwork with studied neutrality. "Mr. Fitch talks too much," she said without heat. "He said you were the most prepared person who ever walked through that door," the young clerk said, with the earnest urgency of someone delivering what he considers a compliment. She looked at the young man for a moment. He was earnest and young and new to the territory, and the world was going to try many things with him before it was done. "What's your name?" she asked. "Henry," he said. "Henry Marsh." "Henry," she said. The preparedness was not remarkable. The willingness to sit down and do the work and know your rights and refuse to be dismissed, that is not a special quality. It is the minimum that any person owes to their own life. She paused. "The thing people found remarkable was that they hadn't expected it of me. That is their limitation, not my accomplishment." Henry Marsh looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he said it as someone who had actually heard what she said, which she appreciated. She took her receipt from Gerald Fitch and walked back out into the October morning. And the sun was high, and the air was clean and cold, and Abel was tied to the post waiting for her with the practical patience of a good horse. She mounted and turned north toward home. The road back was 14 miles of land she knew as well as she knew anything in the world. She knew where the creek crossed the road and where the cottonwood stood along it. She knew where the ground rose toward the pine-covered ridge and where it dropped into the broad river-bottom valley where her cattle spent their winters. She knew the particular sound the road made under hoofbeats when the ground was frost-hardened, and the way the light changed in the afternoon as the sun moved west and the shadows grew long from the hills. She knew where the lightning-struck pine was, though she couldn't see it from the road. She knew it was there. She rode north through the October afternoon and thought about everything that had happened in this valley in the past 8 years, the way you think about things when you have enough distance to see them whole. She thought about Thomas and about grief and about the way grief, when you carry it honestly and don't put it down prematurely, eventually becomes something you can hold and keep moving at the same time. She thought about the land office and Daniel standing in the doorway. She thought about the surveyor's notebook and the fence they had built over 3 years. She thought about the April afternoon on the hillside and the night in the hotel in Sweetwater and the Tuesday evenings and the Thursday mornings and everything after. She thought about Thomas Daniel at 4 years old following Daniel through the barn with complete devotion, and about Clara, now 3, who had her mother's directness and her father's patience in strange and effective combination. She thought about the children they would raise on this land, who would know it from their first steps and love it with the specific love of people who understand what it cost. She was 35 years old and she was riding north on a good horse on a clear October day to a ranch she had fought for and kept and built into something real, and she was going home to a man who loved her as completely and honestly as any person could love another, and there was supper to be made and fence to be checked and a 4-year-old who would want to tell her everything that had happened while she was gone. She put her hand briefly on the gun at her hip. Thomas's gun. Her gun. The weight of it was familiar and right, and it said everything she needed it to say. She pressed her heels to Abel's sides and let him open up into a canter, and the cold air rushed past her, and the hills rolled on all sides in their October gold and amber, and the valley opened ahead of her, wide and impossible and entirely hers. The Winslow Carver ranch was visible when she crested the last rise before the fork, its buildings solid and well-tended against the background of the ridge, smoke coming from the chimney of the house with the glass window, a horse moving in the near corral, 2 small figures near the gate. Even at this distance she could tell which was which. Thomas Daniel stood very straight, the way Daniel stood. Clara had her arms extended for balance, testing her footing on the bottom fence rail with the fearless experimental courage that characterized all her endeavors. And Daniel was there. She could see him coming around from the barn, and even at this distance, across the width of the road and the slope and the afternoon air between them, she could see when he looked up and saw her on the rise, and she knew the moment he registered her because even from here she could see him stop and wait, and the waiting had the quality of someone who has found what they were looking for. She rode down the long slope toward home, toward all of them, with the October sun warm on her face and the gun on her hip and everything she had built around her, and she was not finished yet, not by a long measure. She had this land. She had these children. She had this man who had walked out of a land office on a cold autumn morning and said, simply, "I think I can help." That was how it had started. That was all it had taken. One person deciding to step forward instead of sideways, and another person deciding to let them. When she reached the gate, Clara fell off the fence rail and caught herself before she hit the ground and popped back up immediately with an expression of pure triumph. And Thomas Daniel said something to her in his careful older brother voice, and Daniel came across the yard with hay on his coat and a question in his face that was really just pleasure that she was back. She swung down from Abel and handed the reins to Daniel without thinking, the way you hand things to someone you trust completely, and she scooped up Clara and settled the child on her hip, and Daniel took her free hand in his and held it. "Good trip," he said. "Good trip," she said. "Fitch has been telling people about the land office." Daniel's mouth moved. "Has he?" "Apparently I am a story now," she said. "You have been a story since the first week I saw you," he said. "That is not news to anyone who has met you." She looked at him. He looked at her. Clara grabbed a fistful of her mother's hair. Thomas Daniel was already heading back toward the barn with Abel, having apparently taken charge of the horse on the theory that someone needed to, and he was the most responsible person available. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold and I'm hungry and your son has taken my horse." "He does that," Daniel said, watching Thomas Daniel lead Abel toward the barn with considerable dignity. "He learned it from you," Anna said. "He learned everything from you," Daniel said. "I'm just there for the fence work." She laughed and turned toward the house, and he came with her, still holding her hand, and Clara bounced on her hip with the exuberant certainty of a child who has never doubted for one moment that she is exactly where she belongs. The house was warm. The fire was going. There was a pot of something on the stove that Daniel had started before she got back, because he was a man who thought ahead, and who had learned that she came home hungry from town, and did not need to also come home to a cold stove. She set Clara down at the table and put her hat on the peg by the door and her coat on the next peg, and she left the gun on its hook beside the door, where it always hung when she was home, in reach if she needed it, and at rest if she didn't. She stood in the warm kitchen for a moment, looking at her house. The table Thomas had built, the glass window with the blue evening coming through it now, the light going dark and soft. The shelves with their books and the canisters and the children's things accumulating on the lower shelf, because that is what children do. They accumulate evidence of their existence everywhere they can reach. Daniel came in behind her and went to the stove and stirred whatever was in the pot, and Clara was saying something about the fence and her achievement in falling and catching herself. And outside, she could hear Thomas Daniel settling Abel in the barn with a seriousness that would have impressed any working rancher in Wyoming territory. She breathed in the smell of the house and the dinner and the coming evening. This was what she had stayed for. This was what she had walked into the land office to fight for. Not just the land itself, though the land was real and essential and worth every letter and every survey and every confrontation, but what the land made possible, the life on it, the people it held. She went to Daniel and stood beside him at the stove, and he shifted to make room without looking away from the pot, and she looked at the side of his face in the warm kitchen light. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she said important things, directly and without ornamentation. He looked at her. His face was completely open, the way it always was with her now, without reservation or performance. "I love you," he said. "I have been loving you," he considered for a moment, "since approximately October of 1878, though I was not certain you would welcome the information at the time." "October of 1878, she said, "when you walked into the land office." "When I walked into the land office and there was a woman at the counter with a survey document and a Colt revolver and the expression of someone who was absolutely going to win," he said. She smiled. "You fell in love with the survey document." "I fell in love with the woman holding it," he said. "The gun was purely incidental." "The gun was never incidental," she said. "No," he agreed. "It was very much the point." Clara said something insistent about supper. Thomas Daniel came in from the barn with hay on his boots, and a report about Abel's condition that was delivered with the professional gravity of a 4-year-old who takes horses seriously. And the kitchen was full and warm and loud and alive. Anna looked at Daniel over the tops of their children's heads, and he looked back at her. And what passed between them in that look was everything they had built and everything they were going to build still. The years ahead on this land, the children growing into their own people, the cattle and the fence lines, and the seasons turning over each other in this valley where they had planted themselves and taken root. Outside, the October stars were coming out, the same stars that had been over them when he first drove her home from supper in Sweetwater, the same stars that had watched her ride north from the land office on the day she had kept her land. The lightning-struck pine stood on the eastern boundary in the dark, the old tree, the marker, solid and permanent as the claims it had always described. Anna Carver, who had been Anna Winslow, who had always been entirely herself, stood in her warm kitchen on her land and looked at her family, and felt the full and complicated and entirely real truth of her own life around her like something she had built with her own hands, which was exactly what it was. She had carried her dead husband's gun into the land office, and she had carried it out again, and she had carried it through everything that came after, and it was still with her, and she was still here, and she was not done yet. She had barely started,